Furi is a boss rush bullet hell game made by French studio The Game Bakers. Furi was released on the 5th of July 2016 to the Xbox, PC and PlayStation platforms, and to a pretty positive reception. Yeah, I know the game came out a year or so ago, but I'm still kinda relevant, as it recently came out on the Switch on the 11th of January, so there. After looking on the Game Bakers site, I was surprised to see that Furi was their first release to the PC, Xbox and PlayStation, with the Switch release coming out earlier this year as mentioned. In fact, out of the 5 games they've released since their founding in 2010, 3 of them have been mobile games. In order of first to last released, we have Squids, Squids Wild West and Combo Crew. They then released Squids Odyssey to the Nintendo DS and Wii U, and finally Furi being the most recent ad topic of the video. The reason I find the lack of console and PC games so surprising is because of what they pulled off with Furi, which ended up being my favourite indie title of 2016 and one I still play to this day. However, it's not flawless, and hopefully in this video I'll be able to outline what I believe worked well, as well as where I think the game faltered. As redundant as the idea may be, given barely anyone will see this and even less will give a half-baked fuck about this video, I'm gonna do it anyway.
You were a weapon, a bringer of death, and now you're nothing.
Furi begins with you being imprisoned and tortured by a character called the Chain. You notice many if not all people in this game follow this sort of naming convention for some reason. The Edge, the Scale, the Hand, the Fat.
Time to wake up.
I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here with you.
Shake your head. Nod your head. It's time to go. See what they did to you? Pull yourself together. Get out of prison.
You're introduced to the Voice, who then sets you free and gives you your weapons.
Kill the jailer. Fight for your freedom.
After a short walk, it's revealed that your prison is a little more elaborate than a simple jail cell, and you're actually currently on top of a series of mini-worlds that each house their own jailer, whose sole purpose it is to prevent you from reaching the planet below, which I can only assume to be Earth, or at least some representation of Earth. It's never really explained to you why you're locked up in the first place, at least not at the start anyway. All you're really told is that you're dangerous and therefore probably locked up for a good reason. Furi prefers to drip feed you the information through dialogue spoken by the jailers during fights, or by the voice in these walking segments that play when you travel between the mini-worlds to get to the next level. These walking sections also work to build up tension before the upcoming boss, as well as to flesh out the voice's motives for setting you free at the start of the game. The only downside to these walking segments is that they aren't skippable if you don't care about the narrative. I personally had no issue with them the first time round, as I wanted to learn bits and pieces about the world and the characters within the game. Only on subsequent runs, where I already knew what was going on and the long build-up only worked to really pad out the runtime, especially as some of them can feel like they're gone forever.
One hour later.
Can you feel it? It's like a dream. The breeze, the peace. Feels like we could take off and leave this place behind us.
2 hours later.
The old man coming up. There's more to him than meets the eye. A master of time, so they say. But if he's such a master, if he saw it all coming, why didn't he do something about it?
Eventually.
Time to move on. Go cross his path, my friend. The jailer is the key.
It's odd in the game so focused around quick movements that they decided to make these moments non-skippable on additional runs. By default, you're left to control yourself during these segments, but I'd highly recommend just using the button to switch on automatic walking, as you control like shit when going manual. For those who have played the game, you could argue there's a speedrun mode that enables you to skip these segments entirely, which is fair, but the downside to this is that if you're like me and you enjoy going for the achievements, then you can't really get the story achievements when playing the speedrun mode. Not to mention that you can't even unlock the speedrun mode until you've completed the game once over. Overall, there's not much to say about the story, as it takes a bit of a backseat to the gameplay, which is by no means a bad thing as the combat is so satisfying and fun to play. The story is less of a focus and more of a tool to give the gameplay a sense of purpose. Anyway, after the voice sets you free, you move on to fight your first boss, that being the chain as mentioned earlier.
Every step you've taken from that cell, I'll make you regret. You listen to me, and you listen good. You'll never escape.
The chain himself acts as a tutorial, at least for the first couple of stages. You run through the basic sword attack, dodge, parry and shooting. At first glance, the combat appears fairly basic, but it's what you can do with these simple moves that makes the fighting so versatile. Your slash can be charged in two different ways. One slows your movement in exchange for a bigger hit, and if done correctly can open up the boss for a combo animation that takes down a fair amount of their health. The other is classified as a boost hit and requires for you to remain still for a short period of time to build up the attack until you start glowing gold, then allowing you to deal a hit that takes a large chunk of health down, which can then be followed up by smaller attacks to make a combo. Unlike the first version of this, the boost hit can only be done in parts of the boss fight where the arena closes in. Your dodge does what you'd imagine it to do, but like the slash ability, it can also be charged. This involves remaining stationary for a short period of time with the trade-off being able to cover more ground when their move completes, making this really handy in the higher difficulties where you have to dodge large area of effect attacks. Parrying, however, doesn't have a charged variant but can open up windows to attack depending on how well timed you are. Time a perfect parry and the boss will open up for a combo. In addition to this, parrying itself grants you a small amount of health which encourages you to get in the boss's face to pull yourself away from death. This gets especially tense when you barely have enough health to survive a hit, but at the same time you need to keep parrying incoming hits to get your health back. Your parry also isn't limited to deflecting melee attacks either, as you can use it to bat bullets back at bosses if your timing is right. Like the dodge and slash, shooting can be charged to fire a shot that cuts through multiple projectiles and can knock bosses down too. What makes this also great is that the basic abilities will get you through to the end of the game. You don't even need to use any of these extras, but they're there if you feel like changing your playstyle and taking bigger risks in exchange for putting in or evading as much extra damage as possible. This makes it so the game's combat system is easily picked up by newcomers, but also challenging to master. Due to this balance, the combat feels like a healthy mix of being simple to understand, without being undercooked and boring. The bosses themselves work in stages. When their life bar is depleted, they'll lose a life and enter the next stage where their health bar regenerates to full, and their moves will change to alter the fight. This doesn't always mean an increase in difficulty though. In fact, I often found the second to last stage on most bosses was the hardest. On the flip side, you also work on a similar life meter, whereby when your health bar drops to nothing, you'll lose a life and the stage you currently have the boss on will reset to the beginning, along with their health too.
I offered you a way out of your cell. Now all I can do is bring you back into it.
No!
As you can imagine, if you've ever played a game before, lose all your lives and it's game over. The fight will fully reset back to the boss's first stage. Combat has a nice balance to it where you feel powerful but at the same time vulnerable. The fights feel frantic at times but also controlled when you get used to your moveset. Not to mention all of this is so well complemented by the game's soundtrack. Furi's soundtrack is one of the best I've heard in a game ever, and to this day is the only game soundtrack I've even bothered to buy. Whether it's in a quieter moment when travelling between fights or during the fights themselves, I always felt like the music was appropriately complementing what I was doing. The best use of it in my mind being during the fight with the burst, where for the first couple of stages you're desperately trying to evade being sniped, meanwhile the soundtrack is energetic and quick, almost like what you need to be in order to avoid getting a game over.
No one said we had to play fair.
Of course, if you don't usually like electronic music, this probably won't be your thing regardless of how well it's implemented.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
Before buying Furi, one aspect of the game that was made clear by various reviews on the Steam page itself even, was that it was difficult. I'd imagine this to be a turn-off for some people, and while I'm not going to sit here and say that Furi is easy and all you need to do is get good, I will say that it is, without a doubt, a fair game, that while challenging, still provides gameplay that feels forgiving as opposed to simply being a trial and error fuckfest. While I got my arse handed to me over and over on some bosses, I always felt like my losses were due to my own carelessness, as opposed to the game being unfair. Attacks will be accompanied by a cue, whether that be audio, visual or both, so in one way or another you can tell the attack is coming. However, some can be a little too quick to catch when you haven't seen the attack prior. But these only took small segments of my health away and were never enough to end me. In fact, out of every attack in the entire game, including higher difficulties even, there's only one that will one-shot you at full health. That being the sniper rifle used by the burst as mentioned earlier. But this is highly telegraphed, and you have a decent enough amount of time to get yourself behind cover so that it doesn't feel cheap. If you don't usually play hard games but Furi still looks interesting to you, then there is a promenade mode you can select at the beginning, only you won't be able to unlock trophies or achievements while playing on this difficulty. This still allows you to see the game from beginning to end, but if you only plan to play the game on this difficulty, then chances are you won't get much out of it. In Promenade you deal more damage than you would on the higher difficulties, and the attacks the jailers throw at you are much easier to evade. Not only this, but the lives on a lot of bosses are also reduced, some even have half the lives they do on the standard difficulty, meaning that chances are you'll complete the game fairly quickly. Which is most likely why Furi recommends you play on the standard difficulty as opposed to the easier one for your first time playthrough. For me personally, I went into the game completely blind and decided to go for the standard Furi difficulty. My first playthrough was littered with knockouts and game overs, as I had never played a bullet hell game like Furi before. But the challenge and learning curve was what made it so rewarding to play, that feeling of getting good through the more I got stuck into it. The third and hardest difficulty is the appropriately named Furia mode, but only becomes available once you've completed your first playthrough. Furia difficulty works in a way I wish many other games would do difficulty. Instead of just being a slider where the damage you deal is lessened and the boss's damage is increased, Furi instead alters what the jailers actually do in terms of their attacks. Stages will be familiar to those that have played the game once through, but this time they'll often have changes made to throw you off balance, taking any methods you perhaps had for the bosses on lower difficulties and altering them so you have to change your tactics. In fact, the damage the bosses deal for each attack is barely even increased if at all in Furia, there's just more to manage. Between you and the planet below, there are 9 jailers. For the most part, they're difficult in their own way, teaching you how to use many different abilities you have at your disposal. However, some have a focus on testing just one skill specifically. The best example of this in my mind is the fight with the 8th boss called the Edge.
You sure took your time. I was concerned you wouldn't make it this far. This is a big day for me. I've been waiting a long time for this moment. Let me show you.
For the most part, his health bar is one of the weakest in the entire game, and on paper his fight is likely to be the one that can be completed in the quickest time. The catch, however, is that if you haven't managed to learn how to use the parry ability, then your experience with this boss is made multiple times harder. The arena itself is very close quarters, so you and the Edge are always in reach of one another. His attacks are quick and can do a fair amount of damage if they land. So you need to be confident with blocking him while also managing to get in as many hits as possible. That in of itself can be tricky, as he tends to dash around a lot. For the most part, you really need to rely on your ability to parry as opposed to dodging. You can try and dash around him, but that will only get you so far in the first couple of stages, not to mention later on when the arena is limited to just a thin plank of wood, where your movements are closed down to simply forward and back.
Let's see how predictable you think I am now.
For me, the Edge gave me the hardest time, as my timing was never something I've been able to master, but this boss makes you master it if you want to see the end credits. That is, unless you want to search for the credits on YouTube or something. The whole learning curve is made so much better by the Edge's dialogue during the fight. He speaks to you like a teacher as opposed to an opponent.
You have more strength than you think. Try and stay with me through this.
After I overcame this, my confidence with parrying got so good that I went from dreading parry segments with bosses to feeling like they were the easier parts of the fight. After killing him, all that's left is the 9th and final jailer, although I feel that people will be a little bit more mixed on what's yet to come. Now I'm going to jump into the last fight in the game, as well as some endgame aspects, so here's your warning if you'd rather see the end stuff for yourself. But given that this game is over a year old, I doubt anyone cares.
Ugh. Well, this is a warm welcome.
The ninth and final jailer is called the Beat. During the walk-up, the voice, instead of creating tension and getting you hyped for the fight like previous jailers, tells you that you're about to fight a naive young girl who doesn't really know what she's getting herself into.
She's an overconfident, idealistic child who dreamed she could save the world.
And when you finally meet her, she looks about as intimidating as a wet cabbage.
Wait till you see the. No, 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 no.
The fight itself begins with her running away. She lets the turrets do all the work with brief stops on little platforms until she reaches a dead end. Once you're there, she barely bothers to attack you if at all and goes down within seconds.
You are a monster!
At first, you'd think this is pretty pathetic for a last boss, but when you consider the narrative, this fight makes a lot more sense. Throughout the whole game, you're told that you're a monster, a heartless killer, murdering your way through all the jailers that stood between you and freedom. Despite some even being friendly to you, with the jailer known as the Song actually offering you safety as opposed to killing everyone.
But you can be free here. Look at what I'm offering. This can be your home. I'll take care of you. I'll tell you the tales of my world. You will tell me yours.
They even take this one step further by making this a secret ending where if you stay with her long enough, you just chill with her until the credits roll.
What a wise decision you've made. We're not so different after all. There is kindness in you.
This fight with the Beat is supposed to be the culmination of all the killing. The intended effect being to truly make you feel like a villain, where you easily blitz through a young girl who had no idea who she was up against. Even the track that plays on the walk up to this fight is called A Monster, with the track during the fight being called You Are the End. For those who only really played Furi for the gameplay, I could see why this fight would be a bit disappointing. After all, it's almost tradition in games at this point to have the last boss be one of the most difficult fights in the game at the very least. However, for me, I like the idea of it as a nice addition to the story, and also as a good victory run after getting to the end.
Please, hold my hand.
This is it, my friend. It's been hard, I know. But she was the last. Finally, going through that door. It's everything we have been fighting for. You are not who you were when you first landed out there. We all have choices to make. We all have to decide what's worth fighting for.
After the fight's over, you head through the final gate and reach the Earth. where your imprisonment at the beginning starts to make a lot more sense, as everything you touch withers and dies as the credits roll. You get a nice little thank you message at the end of the credits for playing the game to the end. If you played the game on Furi or difficulty, you're even met with a slightly different message that congratulates you for playing the game the right way. The game's over now, right?
Psych!
This isn't quite the end yet, however. If you continue to play past the credits, you're given free reign to go where you want. You can see the voice for a little extra cutscene where he's reunited with his daughter by the beach, or your attention will immediately be drawn to the large structure with the UFO floating in space in the background. If you approach this building, a scene plays where you get into a mech thingy and fly towards the mysterious UFO, where you're met by what I can only assume to be some kind of AI, known in the game as the Star. You learn from the Star that your original task before getting captured was actually to scout out the planet in order for a full-scale invasion where all life would be wiped out so you could make it your home. You get a choice of two options. One leads you to finish what you set out to do in the first place and invade. The game ends with a cutscene playing as you and other clones of yourself attack the planet below, as the voice and his daughter look on. This is obviously the evil ending. The other option involves denying the invasion and opting to fight the AI, which then leads into the real last boss. The fight itself was one of the more challenging ones for me, as you have multiple objects you need to keep an eye on at once to avoid getting molested by glowing balls and death rays. Unlike the other fights in the game, this is the only boss that is purely fought with a gun. You have no ability to use your sword during all stages, and have to rely on using your attacks to shoot down others, as well as dodging too, all while the Star calls you a traitor for turning against it.
Will you destroy us to save this world that is not yours? I am disappointed in you, Ryder.
When the fight's over, you kill the Star and destroy the UFO, then returning to the planet as the voice happily looks on, knowing you did the right thing. For the most part, the idea of two endings works well. The bad ending shows that you were evil all along and couldn't give less of a shit about anyone else, while the good ending shows that you've gone from invader to saviour during the course of the game. However, while I don't have any issues with the good ending, I feel there was a serious missed opportunity with the way the bad ending was executed. My problem stems from the idea that the good ending was the only one with a boss fight. However, the evil ending is limited to just a cutscene that I feel ends in a way that's far too abrupt.
Hello, brother. Do you want to destroy the whole fucking world?
Yes.
I feel like the bad ending could have benefited from a fight of its own.
But Logan, there are no bosses left. You've already killed all the bosses in the game, you stupid idiot. There is no one who could fill that role of the evil ending's final boss.
Not quite. The voice himself would have been perfect for the role as the last boss. Think about it. After choosing to invade the planet, you head back down to Earth with your army of clones, only to be met by the voice standing with his daughter. You could then have a scene where he laments over the fact that he was wrong about you changing your ways and that you really are the cyber Hitler everyone's saying you are. Then, in a desperate attempt to save himself and his daughter, he chooses to fight you. This would have been a perfect round-off for players that primarily care about the story, as well as the ones that care more about gameplay, because you would get a dark conclusion where you end up killing the one person that helped you escape in the first place, really cementing you as a monster. This would then also be a good send-off for people who hated the easy fight with the beat. The final fight with the voice could be made to give people a challenging endgame as opposed to the beat being the final boss if you picked the evil ending. You could argue that the voice isn't even a fighter, but if you pay attention midway through the game, you enter a stage where a jailer is missing and the voice explains to you that he somehow managed to kill him all by himself.
Oh, it's you. Well, I took care of this one. It was really tough. I'm no fighter like you, but I got my way. After the last jailers, I felt you deserved a little more from me. Call it my contribution to our escape. We're in this together. Now more than ever.
That's because the voice in the game's story was actually meant to be a boss until he went rogue to get you out and escape. This was even confirmed in an AMA on Reddit by the devs themselves. This empty stage was actually supposed to be his stage where he was meant to fight you. So if the voice was already a jailer before he rescued you, then why not have him as an endgame fight instead? Who knows though, perhaps this was an idea but the devs just didn't have enough time or resources to fully implement it. Overall, the game took me around 4 hours to beat on my first playthrough. They may not sound like much, but there's more you can do afterwards, such as playing the game speedrun mode to see how fast you can finish. There's even a couple of achievements for beating times set by the devs, which is a nice touch. Furi difficulty, as mentioned earlier, unlocks after your first playthrough too, if you want to really test yourself. And lastly, for extra challenge, you can use the game's practice mode to fight every boss to see if you can get an S rank on them all. Doing this actually unlocks concept art for the bosses as a small addition. That's pretty much it for the base game. As for the DLC, Furi has one content pack called One More Fight, although I'm not quite sure why it's called that, as it's actually 2 fights, not 1. The first boss is the Flame. In my opinion, he's one of the more fun fights in the game due to how diverse he is in terms of his attacks, constantly mixing ranged and melee abilities that combined make for a pretty challenging boss. He also has some attachment to the game's story too, as indicated by his dialogue during the stages. He talks to you as if you fought before, and at the end he refers back to his friends that you killed presumably before the events of the main game, hinting that perhaps you tried to escape before, although it's not quite clear. My first thought when defeating the Flame was that I wish he was part of the story, but after a look on various forums online, I found that on the Xbox version this was actually the case, with him featuring as a boss after you defeat the Beat and reach Earth. According to some users on Steam, the game bakers had the Flame as a timed Xbox exclusive when the game released, as this is apparently a deal that indie devs have to make with Microsoft if they want to release the game to their platform, with the PS4 and PC versions not being able to feature him during their exclusivity period. Then when the timed exclusive deal expired, the fight was added back in via DLC, but he couldn't be incorporated into the main game as this would involve editing the current game that the PC and PS4 players had, which posed problems when considering that in order to add the Flame into the game, they'd need to change all the leaderboards for the story to account for the extra boss. It was much easier just to add him as an option in the menu, which I can understand from a development perspective. It's just a shame that the timed exclusivity for the Xbox affected the game for players on the other platforms. After you defeat the Flame, you unlock an extra fight with a mysterious man called Bernard. Now, Bernard is not just a boss. Bernard is every boss. Bernard is your worst fucking nightmare. At first I looked at Bernard and thought, how hard can he be? His name's fucking Bernard. That was until I booted up the boss and my attention was immediately turned to the 9 stages he has.
What the fuck is that?
Far more than any other boss in the game. He's also the one boss that can only be fought on Furia difficulty. Each stage chronologically is a representation of the bosses in the main game, excluding the Star and the Flame. The only exception being the last stage where he goes into fucking overdrive and fires every attack one after the other in a final attempt to render the 15 or so minutes it took for you to get to this point obsolete. You may wonder how the 8 remaining stages cover 9 bosses, but that's due to the fact that the 8th stage uses moves from the Beat in the first section, and then the Edge's abilities in the second part. Bernard himself has no connection to the story at all, and is clearly a test boss just used in the development of the game that's been repurposed as a challenge fight, which is a nice way of reusing your assets. He has no dialogue at all beyond mild grunts and the odd chuckle that sounds like the chain.
Do you honestly think you're fucking funny?
He took me ages to beat, nearly matching the time it took me to beat the main game the first time round. My only major gripe with him is the lack of an incentive to even attempt the fight in the first place. You'd think after beating the hardest boss in the game you'd get at least something substantial, but you just unlock concept art for the voice in your character. Personally, I'd have loved to have seen just little additions like customizable character models for completing certain challenges. I get that skins aren't exactly revolutionary, but at least let me play as Bernard after spending roughly 3 hours beating the cunt and sustaining a head injury bashing my head against my desk in frustration. Overall, if you enjoyed the base game like I did, the One More Fight DLC is a nice addition to the game that I felt was more than worth my time. In conclusion, Furi is a great indie game for those who enjoy constant action with quick movements and challenging gameplay. The story, while minimal, does its primary job of acting as a backbone for the trials you go throughout the game. All of this held up of course by the game's amazing soundtrack. And while Furi isn't without its flaws, they are nothing in comparison to the fun I had playing for the 30 or so hours so far, and it's definitely one I'll come back to in the future. Whether or not this game looks like it's worth 15 odd quid to you is really only something you can decide for yourself. Perhaps if you're not sure, just wait for a sale to roll around on whatever platform it is you play on, and give it a try if it's something you think you might like. But for me, I'm confident that Furi was far worth my time and money spent on playing it to the end. And for a games developer formerly known for various mobile games about squids, this first jump to PC, Xbox and PS4 releases is really something to be commended, and I look forward to seeing what else the game bakers put out in future. Thank you for watching, if you even got this far.